government and one more religious system.
The Shroud of Turin. What's new in your research there?
You know, I've been an amateur syndologist for about 30 years, ever since I got interested in this stuff. And I realize there's a lot of controversy about it. I know Mr. Nickel was on your show and thinks that the Shroud is just a painting and it's just a forgery. Well, the research that's come out with this is, in my opinion, just incredibly phenomenal, fascinating. For those of your listeners who don't know what the Shroud is, it's this cloth. It's about 14 feet 3 inches in length. I'm looking at my notes here, and 3 feet 7 inches wide. It has a very faint image of a Middle Eastern male who has been beaten, scourged, and crucified in exactly the way that we all know Jesus was described in the Scriptures. What's bizarre about this is the cloth doesn't surface for centuries later. But we know that it was moved to Turin in 1578. Here's something that's really interesting, which most people don't know. There's a face cloth. It's called the face cloth, and it's in Spain. I can't remember the city off the top of my head. What's interesting about it is they can trace that. They know it's been there since about the 7th century. So they know for a fact it's been in the same location since the 7th century. Okay. What's interesting about the face cloth is it's got this blood stain on it, and it's always been allegedly to be reported that this thing is the cloth that laid over the face of this crucified man Jesus in the 1st century. So what they did is they tested the blood of the shroud,
okay,
and compared it to the face cloth, and what they found was it's the same blood type,
same match.
What's even more interesting, when you overlay, take a photograph of the face cloth, and you take the shroud and the face and you overlay the two, there's over 50 to 100 points of congruency. In other words, it matches. It matches. That's just one thing. They found coins over the eyes. Okay, very faint, but they're there. Coins that are holding the eyes shut. And they are what's called in the Scripture literally a widow's mite. They're minted. They were only found in Palestine, and they were minted, I think, in the years 29 and 30 A.D., the coins. Okay, that's just a couple of interesting things. Where they took, and this is what most skeptics say, well, they carbon dated this thing and they found it was a 15th century forgery. And you'll get in an argument with me on that. Recent discovery is there was a fire, and the shroud apparently was burned in several places. Allegedly, as the story goes, the poor sisters of Clare sewed the patches into the shroud. Now, when they were supposed to carbon date the shroud, they were supposed to, and they all agreed on this. You can go, I'm not making this stuff up. You can go back and look at it. The protocol was they were supposed to get 3 samples from 3 different places on the shroud and divide those samples equally and then distribute them, and everyone would have blind samples. No one would know who's testing what or where, right? Well, they didn't do that. They took one sample from one place in the cloth. That was it. Yeah. Well, guess where they took it? They took it from where the patch was actually rewoven. And what was interesting is just come to light that there are literally end-to-end splices in the thread, that the splice is so carefully, so perfectly done, they're end-to-end splices, and you can actually see that. Which, again, begs the question, why would, it's like they took this from where the splices, where the patch was sewn into the shroud, which was done after the fire, and that's why it dates from, it has a later date instead of a 1st century date. There are plants in the shroud and pollen in the shroud. Again, this is all scientific stuff, which are only indigenous in and around Jerusalem, which begs the question, how did they get there, and why would a forger somehow incorporate that? It's definitely not a painting. There's light traces of painting on the shroud, but it's definitely not a painting. Another thing which is really anatomically startling, we see pictures of the crucifixion. We see nails usually through the palms of the hands. Well, in the shroud, it's not that way. In the shroud, the nails go through the wrists. And that's the only place, the Romans knew this, by the way, the only place you can hang a man is right there. If you put a nail in the palm, it won't hold the weight. It'll just come right off and split the hand in half, and the man will fall off the crossbeam. But if you put it through the bones in the wrist, you don't break the bone, and you basically impale the man there, and he can't move. The Shroud of Turin shows that. I mean, I can talk about this for almost hours. It's just fascinating.
All right, are you conflicting though at all with your belief in the shroud and its authenticity and the Great Deception?
No, I don't think so, because the shroud, I believe, is the real deal. I believe it's a calling card. I believe it's a calling card. I believe it speaks of a physics that we know nothing about. There's actually a physicist who looked at the shroud and has a theory on it. She calls it like the event horizon, and she believes that the body was wrapped in the shroud. I mean, here's something interesting. We know the body was wrapped in the shroud. Okay, we know that. All the mythos, if I can use that word, tell us that. But the Gospels tell us that the body was laid in this tomb. A stone was rolled over. By the way, the spices were used. I know Mr. Nickel last time he was on, made a big reference to the fact that the spices, there's no traces of the spices used. The spices were not used to embalm the body. The Jews did not embalm anybody. The Egyptians did that. The spices were used. Usually they were burnt as an offering, or they were placed in the tomb to keep the smell down. But that's why they're not in the shroud, because they didn't wrap bodies that way. That's not what they did in the ancient world, especially in the Jewish custom. So what's interesting is that this body laid in this tomb for a period of time, and it's fascinating. They can tell the rigor mortis and was actually starting to set in, and they know this from the way the body's positioned. The forensics looks at the shroud and can tell about how many hours it was in the tomb before the resurrection actually happened. And it happens right at a critical point where the body is in rigor mortis, but I guess any further and it starts to decay. It hasn't really started to decay yet, according to the research. Here's the deal with this physicist believes. She believes that millions of points of light happened simultaneously, and the body completely evaporated and went into another dimension. In other words, it speaks of another science which we know nothing about. Absolutely nothing about. It's beyond anything we know. The whole body was simultaneously, just like at millions of different points, evaporated, was translated, and that process created the image on the shroud. Now that's her theory. What's interesting also is when you look at the pictures of the shroud, you don't see the forearms because the blood covers the forearms. Yet when you make a holographic picture of the Shroud of Turin, guess what shows up? You see the forearms. So it's just so outside. If you really look at it with an open mind, in my opinion, I think it's a calling card. It's not going to. It doesn't change my beliefs, but I think it's a calling card. I think he left that calling card for us. And I mean, there's so many different aspects of the shroud, which I think specifically the carbon dating. They should really go back and do that again and do it the way they wanted to do it. Go to 3 different parts of the shroud, take it from make sure that the places weren't resewn or repatched, and then do another carbon-14 test and see what happens. Apparently, the Vatican will not allow them to do that.
And now let's talk a little bit about the Vatican, where several weeks ago they came out and said belief in ET life, extraterrestrial existence, does not negate the belief of God or divine creator. Are they trying to tell us something too?
Yeah, I do. I think everybody's in cahoots. Call me paranoid. Here's something interesting. The present Pope Benedict, and I'm going to tie this back into Fatima because I think it's all part of the same equation. I think people that need to know find out. They're brought in on the inner circle. Call me crazy. But
all right, you're crazy.
Benedict at one time read the third secret of Fatima and was a proponent of the Fatima apparitions. He believed in them. Okay, he believed them. He defended them. He read the third secret. He championed them. And now all of a sudden he's distanced himself from Fatima, and I have it on record as him saying Fatima was for another time in another century. What does he know that he didn't know then?
And why is he distancing himself?
And why is he distancing himself? Because if he says, let's say I'm right about the Fatima apparitions. Let's say the Fatima apparitions are what I believe they are. They're demonic deception, that it was a silver disc, a.k.a. a UFO. If we were in the field, George, we would go, oh, my gosh, they're manifesting. It's a UFO. It's a flying saucer. So Benedict, in the 80s, when he's championing this, he's not brought in on the inner circle. He believes in Fatima. But then let's say this is all conjecture, okay? All conjecture. It's a scenario. Then he becomes Pope, and now he's brought into the inner circle, so to speak. He realizes that if he says Fatima is the real deal, he's telling, he's actually propagating a lie. So he says it's for another time, another place. He distances himself